The topic is the nebulous origins of Taanis Esther. Some of you may have had an experience that when you've asked a shaila, does my wife have to fast, do I have to fast? Then Taanis Esther is even easier than all of the other ta'aniyot, even the four minor fasts that we do to commemorate the Korban. This is sort of the easiest fast to get a heter for to not fast, because it occupies even a lower station, at least according to many poskim, as far as the obligation to fast. There are two sort of murky areas. One is the fact that there is no mention of Taanis Esther in the Medrash or in the Gemara. And the references that we will make to the Gemaras do not reference Taanis Esther explicitly, but they are derived from statements in the Gemara. That's one difficulty. And the second area of difficulty, which the poskim are very clear to acknowledge in the Shulchan Aruch itself, is that normally a holiday is not supposed to be preceded immediately by a fast day. It's a very unusual kind of juxtaposition to have a Taanis leading into a day of great celebration. Taanis Bechoros is also, that's actually a good point, but Taanis Bechoros comes well after the institution of Pesach. But you can make a stronger argument for Taanis Bechoros than you could for Taanis Esther, because normally when Chazal instituted a rabbinic holiday, they wanted to be mechazik the rabbinic holiday by banning certain kinds of sadness before and after, so that people would bolster and reinforce the nature of the holiday. Whereas by Pesach, since it's a biblical holiday, there's much more of a reason for us to be allowed to have a Taanis on Erev Pesach. But the fact of the matter is that, as we'll see, it's not really clear that it's even permitted to fast on Erev Purim, just like there's a question of whether it's permitted to fast on Erev Chanukah because they're rabbinic holidays. And even more than that, there is a special quality to the 13th of Adar that is noted by the Gemara that has nothing to do with Taanis Esther. And the way that the Gemara discusses the 13th of Adar, which is what our Taanis Esther is described as a day of celebration, not a day of fasting. So those are the things that require analysis to see where this minhag comes from. It does seem to be of, well, again, is it Talmudic in origin or is it post-Talmudic in origin? That's something that needs to be discussed, and we're going to end it. We're going to leave that question open-ended. It's definitely a minhag, and it's definitely codified in Shulchan Aruch that if a person is healthy, he is obligated to fast on Taanis Esther. We're not here to dispense with the fast, but we are here to discuss what the origins of it are and how we got to it today. There are no chidushim. We'll only see one 20th century posek today, but this is all really just mostly Rishonim and Achronim. So let's take a look. The first stop is number 1 on your sheet, the Gemara in Maseches Megillah Daf Tes Zayin Amud Beis. The Gemara it's in the Agadita section at the end of the first parak of Maseches Megillah, where it says Uma'amar Esther Kiyam Divrei HaPurim Ha'ila, that it says that the edict of Esther sort of established the holiday of Purim. So the Gemara asks the question, Ma'amar Esther Divrei Hatzomos Lo, because the previous pasuk talked about the fact that there was fasting for the Jewish people. And yet it seems that the pasuk that comes after it says that only the edict of Esther to have a holiday of Purim was established for all generations. So the Gemara says, what about the fasting that was not established? Amar Rabbi Yochanan Divrei Hatzomos ... meaning that it says Divrei Hatzomos v'za'ak hasam is what the language of the pasuk says. The words of fasting and the cries of the Jewish people were recorded for all posterity. That's the end of the previous pasuk. And then it says, Uma'amar Esther Kiyam Divrei HaPurim Ha'ela, and that the edict of Esther established these words of Purim. Now, what exactly the Gemara is trying to convey over here is extremely vague. It's extremely vague what the Gemara is trying to convey here. One could suggest that all the Gemara is doing is trying to explain to us what was recorded for all posterity about the holiday of Purim. Was it merely the edict of Esther to institute a holiday of Purim? Was that the only historical aspect of Purim that was recorded for all posterity? All one has to do is open up Nebulous Esther and see that there were other things that are recorded as part of the story. That the Jewish people fasted and they cried out to Hashem. And that is also a very important part of the story. We shouldn't just recall the celebratory parts of Jewish history, but we have to recall the oppressive parts of Jewish history to remind ourselves how we've been able to call out to Hashem, and He's, through our tshuva and our prayers, has been able to, has saved us throughout the course of history. That would be the Pashup shot of the Gemara. Now, comes along the Rambam, and the Rambam says in Hilchos Taanis, where he talks about all the laws of fasting. This is not the laws of Purim, this is laws of fasting. Hilchos Tanios Perek Hey Halacha Hey, says the Rambam, V'noagu kol Yisrael bismanim elu lihisanos, that the Jewish people fast during the following times, and one of them is B'shlosha Asar Ba'adar, they fast on the 13th of Adar. This is a custom, says the Rambam, Zecher L'Taanis Shehisanu Bimei Haman. It is to remind us of the fast that the Jewish people fasted in the times of Haman. Shenemar divrei hatzamos v'za'akosam. As it says that the words of fasting and the cries of the Jewish people were recorded for all posterity. Kiyam. There was a kiyum, a historical recording for all posterity of this episode of the fasting and the cries of the Jewish people, which the Rambam understands is not just creating a historical record, but is also instituting a commemoration, a religious commemoration within Jewish practice, and that is how we get the law of Taanis Esther. So according to the Rambam, part and parcel of the initial decree of having a Yom Tov of Purim was to have a fast of a fast on the 13th of Adar to precede it. Not everyone is happy with this. If you take a look in source number 13, it's from Sefer HaAguda, who's a Rishon, Rav Alexander Zuslin HaKoyen, who was from the 14th century. And I apologize for the difficult print. We're just gonna jump in. He says that he's talking about a custom that is quoted by the She'iltos and Rabbeinu Tam. The She'iltos is written by Rav Achai Gon, and Rabbeinu Tam, who's a Rishon, one of the Tosafists. They talk about the custom to fast on Erev Purim, which we're going to get to in just a moment. And he writes explicitly, and it's 5 lines from the bottom, he says, V'lo mishum dichsiv divrei tzamos. But it's not, we don't fast on Erev Purim because of the words divrei tzamos that is written in the Megillah, in direct contradiction to the Rambam. And he says, and I'll prove it to you, he says, Di'im kain ha'kasiv v'za'ak ha'sam, because it says in the Megillah that the episode that we are commemorating is fasting and crying out to God. And he says, Umay za'aka b'doros ika. And what crying is there in all subsequent generations? Meaning, a commemorative fast day does involve some level of tshuva and soul searching and davening to Hashem. But the za'aka that we would think happened at the times of Purim when the Jewish people were in dire danger of being exterminated by Haman cannot be replicated unless you're under deep oppression and unless there is something looming over you, where imminent destruction is looming over you. Almost reminds you of what's going on with Iran today. In other words, sometimes HaKadosh Baruch Hu orchestrates looming threats in order to allow us to replicate the Za'aka. But the Aguda says you can't expect that to be replicated in every generation. So he says it can't be that pasuk is telling us to replicate the fasting of the Jewish people, because it says there is fasting and crying out to Hashem. And that, says the Aguda, is not something that we can just replicate on demand. He says, Kain Kosav V'machzor Vitri, and he says on that basis, because of the fact that this is not clearly explicit in the text, and it was not part of the original edict of the laws of Purim, Hilkach Yecholim Lahakel Ba'oso Taanis. That's the reason why we can be so lenient on this fast day. Lemu'ubaros, ula yolados, ula menikos, for pregnant women, for women who have just given birth, for women who are nursing, ula ko'ave, is that einayim, I think? Right? And people who have an eye ache or other kinds of body aches. The yifru yom acher, and they can always make up the fast, because it's a very easy fast to dispense with. But if you do end up eating, you should fast in addition, find another day afterwards to fast. However, healthy people shouldn't just say, well, there's no clear source in it in the Megillah for fasting, and therefore I'm not going to fast. No, you can't just throw it away like that. You can't just discard it so easily. You have to take it seriously if you're healthy. Why? Al tifrosh min hatzibur. I mean, do you understand this rationale? It's not because necessarily, says the Aguda, that there's a religious significance to it. But if something is adopted by the rest of Klal Yisrael, al tifrosh min hatzibur, you shouldn't separate from what Klal Yisrael is doing. Klal Yisrael, when they commit themselves and they accept upon themselves a practice, then the very acceptance of that practice imbues it with kedusha. You understand? There is something to be said about that. Hanach lahem liYisrael. Leave the Jewish people alone, because in lav neviim hem b'nei neviim. If we're not prophets, we're the sons of prophets. So anything that we, the Jewish people, adopt as a religious practice, even if the origins of it are somewhat nebulous and we're not sure exactly where it comes from, we have to respect it and we have to be part of the Jewish people's practice. That seems to be what the Aguda is saying. Go back to source number 3, and you'll see that the Levush, also the language that the Levush employs, is also somewhat vague and sort of searching to find a source for Taanis Esther. He says in the Levush in Siman Tafresh Pei Vav, Sif Beis, he says, "V'kiblu aleihem lechova u'letainis tzibur lechol davar," that the Jewish people voluntarily accepted upon themselves as an obligatory fast on this day, mishum shabo nikalu bimei Mordechai ve'Esther lihilachem v'lamod al nafsham, because this is the day when Mordechai and Esther pooled their resources together and organized a war to be able to protect their lives. And a day like that, when you're about to go out and fight against your enemy, clearly requires a tremendous amount of prayer and supplication and mercy from God. And look at what his language is, umistama. What does umistama mean? Presumably, right? Presumably, they fasted on that day. Meaning that it's true, I can't prove to you, we have no evidence that they fasted, but presumably they fasted because it was a day that required a tremendous amount of rachamim from Shemayim. Shekein matzinu b'midrash, and we find in the Medrash that says, Shemoshe Rabbeinu olav hashalom haya mis'ana b'yom shenilcham im Amalek. We have a precedent for fasting before you go out to war with Amalek. Who was the original fighter of Amalek? That was Moshe Rabbeinu with his army when the Jewish people first left Egypt. And we find that he fasted according to the Medrash on the day that he went out to fight with Amalek. V'im kain vadai b'mei Mordechai gam kain hisanu b'yom shahaya lehem milchama im tzareim. So we certainly have to conclude that if Mordechai is going out to fight with Amalek, he must have also fasted. And because we celebrate Purim nowadays to remind ourselves of the miracle, gam kein srichim anu la'asos kemosam. So we have to replicate exactly what they did back then, be'inyan hatainis v'haslichos v'hatachanunim, as far as praying and fasting and doing exactly what Mordechai and Esther did right before they went to war. Ki im es hatov nekabel v'hara lo nekabel bitmiyah. We should only accept upon ourselves the good, but not accept upon ourselves the bad. Meaning that if, no pain, no gain. If we're going to celebrate Purim, then we also have to sort of indulge in the tribulations that preceded Purim as well. Isn't that curious? We don't do that for Hanukkah, right? Hanukkah involved a tremendous war with the Yevanim. There were casualties. There was tremendous fighting, right? So Shouldn't we argue the same thing, that mistama, before you go out to war with your enemy, you got to daven, you got to pray. And so why don't we have a Taanis Matisyahu, or a Taanis Yehuda HaMaccabi, or a Taanis Yochanan Kohen Gadol, something like that. It is very interesting, and again, the Levush is saying that this is, in all likelihood, what took place, even though we have no specific source for it.
Of Esther fasting for 3 days with Haman.
Esther fasted for 3 days, but when did she fast?
Pesach time.
She fasted Pesach time. Okay, good. All right. Let's go on. Now we're going to see, so there's one source that seems that the Rambam calls from, that, as I pointed out to you, that the Aguda disagrees with, but the source that the Rambam seems to call from is the Gemara that quotes the pasuk that says, Divrei hatzamos v'za'akosam kiyam umamar is there kiyam, that there was a kiyum not only for the celebration of Purim, but also for the fasting before it. That's the way the Rambam pulls it out of the pasuk in the Megillah. Let's take a look at another makor. This one is from the Gemara in Maseches Megillah Daf Beis Amud Aleph. The Gemara asks, you know the famous Mishnah, Megillah Nikreis, that the Megillah can be recited sometimes not just on the 14th and 15th, which are Purim and Shushan Purim respectively, but also sometimes Makdim and Liyom HaKenisa, you can sometimes read the Megillah on the 11th of Adar, and the 12th of Adar, and the 13th of Adar. Right? You're familiar with that famous, and it all depends if you're the member of a kfar, if you belong to a small village, and you need to be able to provide for the needs of the larger cities. So Chazal made an allowance that if you're coming into the big village, to the big city, and you'll have the opportunity to hear the Megillah, then they created leniencies for Bnei Kfarim, for villagers, to be able, who are going to be making special trips into the big city on the 11th, 12th, or 13th of Adar, that they could hear the Megillah then as well. So the Gemara over there asks the question, Megillah Nikreis be'achad asar min alan. How do you know that you're allowed to read the Megillah on the 11th? And I'm skipping a lot of the lines in the Gemara, but comes along Amar of Shaman bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kra, because the pasuk says Lekayem es yemei hapurim ha'ele bizmanehem, that the pasuk in the Megillah says to fulfill the days of Purim in their times in plural, which indicates zmanim harbe tiknu lahem, that there were multiple days of reading of the Megillah in addition to 14 and 15. And the Gemara then continues, and I'm just skipping a couple of lines here, zmanehem dumya dizmanam. Mazmanam trei, af zmanehem trei. So the Gemara concludes that there must be 2 additional days in addition to 14 and 15, which were the days that they celebrated Purim back then in the original historical event of Purim. They celebrated 14 and 15, and Zmanehem implies that there were an additional 2 days to correspond to the original 2 days. So you've got 14 and 15, so there must be an additional 2 days in addition to 14 and 15. So the Gemara says that's 11 and 12. 11 and 12, and the 14 and 15. What are we leaving out? 13. Oh, good, you did the math. Okay, so the Gemara says, Ema tracer replacer. Why 11 and 12? Why not 12 and 13? 14 and 15 should lead you to 12 and 13. Right. So the Gemara answers, Keda Amar of Shmuel bar Yitzchak, Shalosha asar zeman kihila lakolhi. Answers the Gemara that the 13th of Adar is a day of communal congregation anyway, v'lo tzarich l'ribuye, and therefore it does not need a special pasuk of Zmanehem to tell you that it's part of the days of Purim. Comes along Rashi, and Rashi tells us that this is the pasuk shot. He says, "Man kihila lakolhi hakol nikhalu lihinakema oivehem bein b'shushan bein b'shar mekomos." Everyone gathered together on the 13th of Adar in order to go out and fight. Kemoshe kasuv b'sefer, as is recorded in the story of the Megillah. You know the story. The Jewish people fought on the 13th, and nachul me'oivehem, and they had respite from their enemies on the 14th and on the 15th. Right? So Hilkach lo tzarech kra l'ribuyi she'roi l'kriya de'ikar hanes bo haya. Therefore, you don't need a pasuk to tell you that you can read the Megillah on the 13th, because that's when the primary miracle happened, that we were able to defeat our many anti-Semitic enemies in Persia. The question, of course, is, and this is something that we're going to see, that the Rishonim challenge Rashi, is that you don't celebrate while you're fighting. The day of celebration was instituted after the fight is over. There's a very famous Meshech Chachma who talks about this in Parshas Bo, and he says, "Bin folo ivecha al tismach," when your enemy falls, don't rejoice. That's why in Jewish practice we don't have days of celebration on the day when we killed our enemies. We have days of celebration after, asher nachu me'oivehem, on the days that we have rested from our enemies, the day after the war.
Hanukkah is the same.
Hanukkah is the same. Exactly.
The war was over.
Once the war was over, then it was time to eat sufganiyot, right? Not before, not during, right? So this is the kasha they ask upon Rashi. So there's a totally different shot in this Gemara, a totally different explanation in this Gemara as to why, again, the Gemara says, this is the main point of this Gemara, you don't need a special riboy, you don't need a special pasuk in the Megillah to tell you that the 13th is included in this Purim celebration, because it's a Zman Kehila Lakol. It's a time of public congregation. So what do those words mean? Rashi says it's the day of the war, and so surely you can read the Megillah then. But that's not how Rabbeinu Tam learns. So let's take a look at Rabbeinu Tam. And Rabbeinu Tam, I don't want to know if we're going to have time to do the whole thing, but he says, he asked the questions that I just presented to you on Rashi. He says it's not clear. That he says, how do you know that we could read it on the 13th? He says that it's not the war that causes us to read it, but it's rather the respite from war that gives us rise to read it. So if you look at the third line in the Rush, which is where the Rabbeinu Tam is quoted, third line in the Rush where he says, V'nira l'ri, the Sugyas Gemara didan ke'ein ha-Yerushalmi, that our Gemara is like the Yerushalmi de Parachasam al shinuya de kayomim asher nachu. The Gemara asks in the Yerushalmi on the word, on those days where we had respite. So the Gemara there asks, Ve'ema Yud Beis Yud Gimel Keneged Yud Dalet V'Tes Vav. Why don't you say that instead of allowing me to read the Megillah on 11 and 12 and 13, I'm only allowed to read the Megillah on 12 and 13, not 11 and 12. Umeshani Rabbi Chelbo Yud Gimel Zuman Milchamahi, V'hi Mochiach Al Atzmo She'ein Nayecha. And answers the Yerushalmi over there, just the opposite of what Rashi was trying to convey to us. That the 13th cannot be the day where the rabbis instituted a time of Purim celebration, because the 13th itself was a day when there was no respite from war. And if there's no respite from war, then any additional indication from the words of the Megillah that you can read the Megillah on additional days cannot be referring to 13. It must be referring to days before 13, i.e. 11 and 12. Perush, and the meaning is, Leka l'ribuye d'lo havu kayomim asher nachu bahem, ela me'ata lo yikru ubo. So then the Yerushalmi asks, well, if that's the case, then you shouldn't be allowed to read the Megillah on the 13th. Lefanav ula'achar in korin, bo ein korin. So the Yerushalmi's conclusion is, we make a kal v'chomer. In other words, really, there's the days of 14 and 15 that are written explicitly in the Megillah. There are an additional 2 days, and it can't be the 13th because that's the day of war. So we have to push it back to 11 and 12. So there must be, so 14 and 15 you can read it, 11 and 12 you can read it. What then gives you a right, ask the Yerushalmi, to read it on the 13th, as the Mishnah indicates? Concludes the Gemara, it can't be that you can read it 2 days before the 13th and 2 days after the 13th, and you've got this poor little Nebush day that's sandwiched in between those 2 days, those 2 sets of reading. How can we not allow it? So therefore the Gemara's argument is that even though technically we shouldn't be allowed to read the Megillah on the 13th, but come on, if it's sandwiched in between 2 days of celebration before and 2 days of celebration afterwards, it's not going to look nice. It doesn't come across nice. to sort of exclude the day of 13. That's the Yerushalmi's pshat. V'hachanami ika lefrushe sugya didan zaman kehila piresh zaman milchama v'leka l'ribuye mikayom asher nachu bahem v'lo mizmanehem demash mazanamanam acherem, etc., etc., etc. So you skip a couple of lines, and the Rosh says, "V'lo nihira l'Rabbeinu Tam." He says, "I still don't understand." Says Rabbeinu Tam, even if you're going to understand according to the Ri, who uses the Yerushalmi to explain why you can read the Megillah on the 13th, Dahavale l'meimar zman milchamahu, because the Yerushalmi should have said explicitly that the 13th is a time of war. It doesn't say that. It just says that it's a day when there was no respite. Va'od kashile hay v'kamer v'lo tzarach kol ribuye derech hashas listam devar kivin shlo huskara kal v'chomer b'gemara didan. And furthermore, our Gemara doesn't seem to be holding like that. And so basically Rabbeinu Tam comes up with a new pshat. Comes along Rabbeinu Tam, and this is really what we're going to be focusing on. Upirish Rabbeinu Tam, Zman Kihila Lakolhu, Shahakol Misasefin Latainis Esther. You know why the 13th is called the Zman Kihila in the Gemara, a time of public congregation? It means it's the day of Taanis Esther. That's what the Gemara on the first Amud of Maseches Megillah was telling us. It was telling us in a very covert way, Zman Kihila on the 13th of Adar means it's the day of Taanis Esther. Uboim b'nei hakfarim la'ayoros lamar slichos v'tachanunim, and that's when the villagers would come to the big cities to daven. They would come to the big shuls to daven on Taanis Esther, lefi shabo nikalu la'amod al nafsham v'hayu tzrichim rachamim, because that was a day to daven and ask Hashem for mercy to commemorate the war that we were about to fight. So that's why the Bnei Kfarim would come, and the rabbis had rachmanis for the Bnei Kfarim, since they're schlepping all the way into the big city anyway. We don't want to make them schlep in a second time on Purim, so we'll allow them to hear the reading of the Megillah on the 13th. Okay? That's where
why doesn't it say Taanis Esther? I mean,
it's a good question. Maybe it wasn't called in the times of the Gemara. Maybe it wasn't called Taanis Esther. Maybe it was just called the day of public congregation to daven.
But not even the word time.
Granted, I grant you that. And then Rabbeinu Tam goes and he says, "L'chein masinu b'Moshe sha'asa Taanis k'shenilcham ba'Amalek," quoting the Levush quotes this Rabbeinu Tam, etc., etc., etc. And then the last thing I wanted you to look at, which is, remind me your name, I forgot.
Jack.
Sorry, Jack. These last two lines of the Rosh, he brings down Maseches Sofrim, which is also quoted by Shulchan Aruch. It says in Maseches Sofrim, Isa Sherabosenu Shebemarav Misanin Ba'adar Shlosha Tanio Shel Esther, that there was a minhag brought in Eretz Yisrael, that there would not be one day of fasting during the month of Adar, but they would fast 3 days in Adar. But they would fast 3 days in Adar after Purim. They would do a Bahab after Purim, like a Monday, Thursday, and Monday after Purim, sort of to atone for all of the drunkenness and gluttony of Purim. Right? That's really why Bahab was instituted in the first place. But what is it coming to commemorate? Bahab is coming to commemorate over here the Shlosha Ta'aniyah Shel Esther, because Esther said what in the Megillah? Vitsumu alai shloshes yomim ulayla vayom gamani v'na rosai yotzum kei. Fast me for 3 days. So we fast 3 days in Adar, and he says, Afal pisha osan hayu benisan, even though Esther's fast was on Purim time, in the month of Nisan, not in the month of Adar, lo hayu rotzim lihisanos benisan shenigu lo ba'avosenu v'hukam hamishkan. They didn't want to institute fasting in the month of Nisan, because that's the month of Geula, the month of redemption, and it's the month when the Mishkan was erected. So it's a day when you're not supposed to say Tachanun. But that's why we don't say Tachanun in the whole month of Nisan. So it's incongruous to have a fast day in Nisan. So therefore they pushed the 3 fast days of Bahab back to commemorate the fasting of Esther, to make it like a Bahab atonement for the celebrations of Purim, and that works out well. However, what Rabbeinu Tam is attempting to suggest, it seems like, or what the Rosh who's quoting this minhag in Maseches Sofrim is attempting to suggest, is that may have something to do with Taanis Esther. This is categorically rejected by most of the Achronim, and the reason is because we never find that there would be a one-day fast preceding Purim to commemorate the fasting of Esther. Maseches Sofrim only brings the minhag to fast 3 days after Purim. So it's difficult to reconcile that this would be the reason for having Taanis Esther. So what have we seen so far? Let's just review. We've seen that one reason for fasting is because there's a presumption that when the Jews went to war, and this is cited by the Rambam and by the Levush, and by Rabbeinu Tam as well, that once the Jewish people went to war on the 13th of Adar, this required fasting, and therefore we have to replicate their fasting as well as their celebration afterwards. It seems a little bit strange that this is not brought and quoted by anyone, but comes along Rabbeinu Tam and he tells us that that's exactly what the Yom Kihila, when the Gemara talks about the 13th being a day of congregating, it's congregating to commemorate the fasting and the prayers that were done in preparation for war. And it's not, therefore, that you're allowed to celebrate on that day. The reason why you're allowed to read the Megillah on that day is only because we have Rachmanis on the Bnei Kfar that are coming to shul for the fasting and the davening, so we'll let them hear the Megillah on that very day as well. So far, so good. Let's skip. Go to source number 8. The Mordechai quotes the Rabbeinu Tam as well, so we won't go through that. Let's go to Maseches Taanis, Perek Beis Mishnah Ches. Kol HaKosav V'Megillas Taanis El Delol Lemispad, that there's a book, an ancient scroll, which predates the writing of the Talmud and which predates the writing of the Mishnah. It's called Megillas Taanis, the scroll of fasting. There are actually 2 scrolls of fasting. One is the Babylonian scroll of fasting, and the other one is the Palestinian scroll of fasting. The Mishnah here refers to the scroll of fasting where it's where the days that you're not allowed to fast. Right? And this was known to Chazal, and it's really the literature that Maseches Taanis is based upon. If you want to see what Megillas Taanis looks like, it's printed in a number of texts. At the back of the Steinsaltz Gemara, he's got a full copy of Megillas Taanis. It goes through every single month out of the Jewish year, and it lists all the days where miraculous or spectacular things happened during Bayit Sheni, during the Second Temple era, or shortly before the Second Temple era. And as a result, the rabbis instituted a prohibition of fasting and eulogies on those days. Sometimes they only prohibited fasting, and they permitted eulogies. Other times they prohibited both fasting and eulogies to be done on those days. So it comes along the Mishnah and it tells us, Kol HaKosav V'Megillas Taanis Lo Lemispad, any time that Megillas Taanis says that there's a day that you're not allowed to eulogize, Lefanav Aser La'acharav Mutter, then you're not allowed to eulogize and fast the day before that special day, but you are allowed to on the day after that special day. Rabbi Yossi Omer Lefanav La'acharav Aser. And Rabbi Yossi says both the day before and the day after is Aser and Hesped and Taanis. However, says the Mishnah, if the day is not as spectacular as the first category, but it's only a day where the rabbi said, just don't fast on that day, so then, lefanav ula'acharav mutter, then you're allowed to fast before and after that day, but Rabbi Yossi Omer lefanav asur la'acharav mutter, before that day it's asur to fast, after that day it's mutter to fast. By the way, you know what one of the days that's recorded in the Megillas Taanis of a day that's of great miracle and celebration? Purim. According to Rabbi Yossi, it would be forbidden to fast on the day before Purim because it's a day lo lehis ana'a bahon, that it's a day that you're not allowed to fast. And if you hold it, it's a day lo lemispad bahon, that's a day you're not allowed to eulogize, and everyone would agree to that. Comes along an interesting Gemara in Maseches Taanis. And here's a perfect example of how oblivious the Gemara is to Taanis Esther. The Gemara has no discussion of Taanis Esther whatsoever in this Gemara, despite the fact that we're discussing fasting on the 13th of Adar. It's quite surprising when you read it. So let's take a look at this Gemara over here. Amar le Reb Chia Labali. Reb Chia says to another sage whose name was Bali, he says, Asper Allah, let me explain to you. Ki Amar Reb Yochanan halacha k'Reb Yossi adolo lehis ana'a. Reb Yochanan was quoted as saying that we paskin like Reb Yossi, but you know which Reb Yossi he's paskin like? on the second Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah, who says that you're not allowed to fast on the day before, those days that are recorded in Megillas Taanis, that it says that you're not allowed to fast. So we paskin, says Rabbi Yochanan, like Rabbi Yossi, that not only are you not allowed to fast on the day of the miracle, but you're not allowed to fast on the day before as well. When we Omer Rabbi Yochanan Hachi, asked the Gemara, since when does Rabbi Yochanan ever say such a thing? Veha Omer Rabbi Yochanan Halacha Kistam Mishnah. The Rabbi Yochanan says we paskin like the Stam Mishnah. We paskin like if a Mishnah is authored anonymously, says Rabbi Yochanan, we have to go like that Mishnah. Utanan, and it says in the Mishnah, Afal Pisha Amru Makdimin V'lo Ma'acharin Mutarin Behesped V'Tainis. That even though the rabbi said that you're allowed to read the Megillah before the 14th and 15th of Adar, you're nevertheless allowed to have Hesped and Tainis on those days that are before Purim. How can Rabbi Yochanan say that you're allowed, that you're not allowed to fast on the day before Purim if the Mishnah says explicitly that you are allowed to fast on the day before Purim? Amos. And what are we talking about? Ilema b'nei chamesar v'kakarolei be'arveisar mishari v'aksiv v'megillas tainis yomar basar v'yem chamisha sarbo yomei puri inon delola mispad bahon. So the Gemara says, when it says in the Mishnah that you're not allowed to fast on the days before Purim, it can't be talking about if you live in a walled city not being allowed to fast on the 14th. The Gemara says that's not what the Mishnah is saying. The only other alternative, says the Gemara, is that if you celebrate Purim on the 14th, the Mishnah is saying that you're not allowed to fast on the that you're allowed to fast on the 13th. How could that be if Rabbi Yochanan says you're not allowed to fast on the 13th? But that can't be the pshat in the Mishnah, says the Gemara. Yom Nikanorhu. The Mishnah cannot be advocating that it's permitted to fast on the 13th of Adar. The Mishnah can't be advocating that. You know why? Because it's the Yom Nikanor day. Well, actually, it's maybe the same Nikanor, but it's a different story. It's Nikanor Day. Sort of like one of those Canadian holidays, right? It's Nikanor Day. It's Nikanor Day. And if it's Nikanor Day, how could the Mishnah tell you that you're allowed to fast? So, what are we talking about? We're talking about the 13th of Adar. The 13th of Adar, it's impossible for the Mishnah to advocate that you'd be allowed to fast because it's Nikanor Day. Now, whatever that means, one thing is clear. The Gemara is suggesting that it can't be permitted to fast on 13th of Adar because it's a day of celebration. We're going to have to figure out how to get around this Gemara if we're going to be fasting on Taanis Esther. The Gemara then just basically later on says, my Nikanor Martrianis. The Gemara also says that the 12th of Adar is also a day that's recorded in Megillas Taanis as a day that you're not allowed to fast. It's called the day of Torornto. Another miracle happened during the Second Temple era. Comes along the Gemara and asks, what is Nikanor Day? The Tanya Nikanor Echad Me'afarche Yevanim Haya. He was one of the Greek higher-ranking officials. And V'chol Yom V'yom Hayameini Fiyado Al Yehuda V'Yerushalayim. Every day he used to wave his hand over Jerusalem in an arrogant fashion. And V'omer Emosai Tipol B'yadi V'aramasena. When will this city fall into my hands that I'll be able to trample it entirely and just obliterate it? But when the Hasmoneans came in the Second Temple era and defeated the Greeks, they amputated his thumbs and his big toes, and they suspended them by the gates of Jerusalem. Let the mouth which spoke with such arrogance and the hands which used to wave over Jerusalem, may vengeance be brought against them.
But then don't you get into being Poloi again?
Okay, it's a kasha. Okay, it's a kasha, but this is really a side issue. Why we celebrate Nikanor Day is really a tangent. But the point is, the Gemara says Nikanor Day, you can't fast on Nikanor Day. So the Gemara, when it says that you're allowed, the Mishnah, when it says that you're allowed to fast before Purim, must be referring to a day other than the 13th of Adar. So the Meforshim have a serious problem with this. Let me just point out historically, what happens first? The story of Purim or the story of the Chashmonaim? Purim. We all understand that. We all know Jewish history. Purim is between the first two temples. The Hasmonean dynasty is during the second temple. So if Nicanor Day was instituted as a day of celebration, and therefore you're not allowed to fast, how could they institute Nicanor Day if it was already instituted as a day of fasting, of a day of Taanis Esther?
There was no fast those days.
When do we first start fasting? Taanis Esther is documented?
But the Rambam says explicitly not that way. The Rambam says that
much later.
But the Rambam can't argue with the Gemara. If the Gemara says that Nicanor Day was instituted after, historically at a later date, and the Rambam says that Taanis Esther was instituted at the same time that Purim was instituted, we have a kash on the Rambam. Right? So let's take a look. Let's take a look and try and understand what's going on over here. First thing we should take a look take a look at the tour. Source number 12. The tour in Siman Taf Reish Pei Vav says, Garsina b'Megillas Taanis es Yom Yud Dalet v'Yom Tesvav ba'Adar Yom Eipur Yud Inun D'lo l'mispad b'hon D'lo l'migzar b'hun Taanesa. The tour just makes a point of saying that you should know that Megillas Taanis records that the 14th and 15th of Adar are days of celebration. They're a day that you're not allowed to have eulogies, and you're not allowed to l'migzar b'hon Taanesa. You're not allowed to fast on those days. The Aflagav de Kaimalan Botla Meginas Taanis, even though we paskin that nowadays all of the days that are recorded in Megillas Taanis were nullified. In other words, since they were Second Temple historical events, they were sort of localized to Second Temple history, and therefore once the temple was destroyed, those days of celebration were abolished. Nevertheless, the Chanukah Upurim lo batla. Chanukah and Purim are the exception to the rule, because they have such universal appeal and they were so remarkable in their miraculous salvation for the Jewish people. They transcend Second Temple history and they are instituted for all posterity. This was what the sages saw with Ruach HaKodesh, that even though other days of celebration when the Jewish people were in a very good state would be abolished, but Chanukah and Purim would never be abolished. And the imkain lifnei mula achareihem nami asur. So if that's the case, then as you know from the Mishnah, or you know that not only are you not allowed to fast on the day itself of the days of Megillas Taanis, but the day before, and according to some, the day after as well, you're not allowed to fast. And so, Kedis b'Maseches Taanis to the Chomak Mishnamar the Lola Mispad and lifnei malacharim nami asur. Afilu hachi. Nevertheless, says the Tur, no hagin lehisanos b'Yud Gimel. We still nevertheless have a minhag to fast on the 13th of Adar, even though it would seem that we're in violation of the halacha that you're not allowed to fast on the day before Purim. He says, "Delo adif lifnei malacharim dechanaku par mishar yomi de Megillas Taanis bekivin sheshar hayamim batlu ikaran umuter lisanos behen afagav dechanakurim lo batlu ikaran lifnei malacharim mihamuter." He says, "You want to know why?" He says, "Because when the rabbis abolished the days of celebration that are recorded in Megillas Taanis, they abolished all the days, and even though they preserved Purim, they still abolished that aspect of Purim and Chanukah that you're not allowed to fast before and after. So the only thing they preserved about Chanukah and Purim is that you're not allowed to fast on that day itself, but the days before and after, once they abolished Megillas Taanis, for the other days they also abolished that restriction of not being allowed to fast the day before and the day after. And that's why you're allowed to fast on Erev Purim. Now, notice over here that the Tur has not provided us with a positive source for Megillas Esther. All he's done is to show us why it's mutter to fast if a person wanted to. You understand? He's just telling us why you have a heter to fast. He's not telling us why you should fast. He's just explaining to us why it's not usher to fast on Taanis Esther. But now, has he given us...
He's also not explaining that period why you can fast also. Right? He's missing that. He's explaining after, because he's saying there's a heter once we abolish, but he's not explaining During the time.
Historically, it would seem that during Bayesheni, it would not have been mutter. Correct. However, comes along, he says, "Va'od yeshmach miha." He says, but furthermore, let me provide you a smach, a support, historically, that there may be a rationale to allow for fasting. In addition to that, he says, "De'isa b'gemara yud gimel zman kihila lakol hi pir shekol miskapsin l'tainis Esther u'boin b'nei kfarm la'ayros lamar slichos v'tachnunum l'pishabon nikolu lamar l'nafsham v'yitzichin rachamim v'adosin kamo shem ha'yosim b'mei Mordechai ve'Esther." And therefore, says the Torah, is that historically, because the Jewish people gathered together during the days of Purim, historically in the times of Mordechai and Esther, to fast, so we do that as well. So that's a support for it. But it's going to, what's going to come out is that you have a heter to fast bisman hazeh, like you were saying, not during the times of Bayesheni, but bisman hazeh you have a heter to fast, and there's a compelling reason to fast bisman hazeh to commemorate what they did. It sounds almost like from the Torah that the institution of Taanis Esther was instituted later. It is commemorative of what they did back then, but the formal minhag of fasting on Taanis Esther did not begin until after Churban Bayesheni. That's what we seem to be pulling out of the Torah. I'll take questions at the end, because it's very misubach to begin with. Okay? So that's what it seems like, is what the Torah seems to be conveying. Let's take a look for a moment.
That's why Nicanor Day was already around.
Well, it would seem that Nicanor Day could be instituted because Nicanor Day then would predate the minhag of fasting. That's what it would seem like. So, in other words, but contrary, I still want to point out, contrary to the Rambam, because it seems like from the Rambam that, well, unless you say, maybe that's the diuk in the Rambam, v'nogu kol yisrael bizmanim elu. Nowadays, the Rambam says we have a minhag to fast. Maybe that's meduyak why the Rambam, I just thought of that. Maybe that's dafka why the Rambam says v'nogu bizmanim elu. Nowadays, we have a minhag to fast because the Rambam anticipated this kasha. And he's saying that we only started doing this minhag once the Bayesheni was destroyed, that we have this minhag to fast. But not in the times of Bayesheni, when it was Yom Nicanor. It was Nicanor Day. Okay. Let's take a look at the Ran on Maseches Taanis, and source number 10. He says, the Ran is trying to explain the makar for the minhag of Taanis Esther. He says, he quotes a Rabbi and he says as follows, Afal pi shabotla Megillas Taanis, Afal pichein ein gozrin osen hayomim Taanis al hatzibur lechatchila. He says, even though there is no longer a Nicanor Day and there's no Torornto Day, nevertheless, those days have an imprint upon Jewish history, and that you're really not supposed to institute a fast day on the days that used to be days that are recorded in Megillas Taanis. V'raya lidavar, and I'll prove it to you, he says, Mimai de amrinan b'gemara de Rav Nachman gozer ta'anesa b'yud beis ba'adar. The Gemara brings a story that Rav Nachman, who lives after the Churban, he instituted a fast day on the 12th of Adar. The 12th of Adar was Torornto Day during the times of the Second Temple. And va'amru la yom Torornto. And they said, hey, Rebbe, how can you make a fast day on Torornto Day? And this is clearly after Megillas Taanis was already nisbatel, after it was already abolished. So you see that there's this remnant of celebratory nature of the day. The Kaven Shabbat la Megillas Taanis ki havi yom Torornto mai havi. Who cares if it's Yom Torornto? Yom Torornto is batal. So what's wrong with Rav Nachman instituting a fast? And therefore, alma mashma da afal pi da batla in gozrin bo Taanis lechatchila ala tzibur. He says, and therefore you see that even bisman hazeh lechatchila, you should not institute a fast on a day which used to be a day of celebration during the times of this Bayesheni. So he says, he says, if that's true, then what basis do we have to permit fasting on the 13th of Adar? He says, it's Nicanor Day. And even though And even though Nicanor Day is no longer extant, it's the remnant of it should still be that we can't institute a fast on that day. So he says, Ela shehuz al kosav, but the Rabbi explains. He says, let me explain to you why it's okay to have a fast day on Taanis Esther. The Yud Gimel Eino Doma L'Sha'ar Ta'anios. He says, because this is not a normative fast day. Taanis Esther, Yud Gimel Avadar, is not a normal fast day. It's the Zikaron Hulaneis Shenasabo. Because it's a commemorative day of the miracle that occurred. In other words, part and parcel of this fast day is not a day of tremendous sadness and mourning and tshuva and all of those other things that come along with a day that commemorates, let's say, the Churban, right? That celebrates the origins of the Churban. This is a day where we're commemorating what they did in preparation for war, but with the knowledge that we were successful and God provided us with a miracle. And furthermore, there's a support in the pasuk she'omar v'chasher ki yimu al nafsham divrei hatzomos. As it says, remember we saw from that Gemara that the Rambam quoted that it says that the Jews established upon themselves the fasting as well. Lomar shekashem shekiblu aleim lasos yom tov, kach kiblu aleim divrei hatzomos v'za'akosa. That just like the Jews accepted upon themselves to celebrate Purim, they also accepted upon themselves to celebrate or to commemorate the fasting as well. Kolomar lasos taanis b'chol shana b'shana, to make a fast every year. So now that the Rabbi has committed himself to say that because Taanis Esther is not a normal fast, but it's a day that commemorates the fasting that took place on that day. And not only that, but he says the Megillah itself indicates that this is what they did initially. That historically they accepted upon themselves, part and parcel with the celebration of Purim, they accepted upon themselves for all posterity to fast. He says, V'chitema im kain sheyud gimel taanis kavuhu heich manu yom nikanor b'chal yomim tovim. How then could the rabbis of the Second Temple era supersede the fast day that was pre-existent from the times of Purim? Right? In other words, it's one thing if we're going to argue, like Rabbi Janowski wants to say, that there was only this memory of fasting on the first Purim in history, and we didn't institute anything until after the Churban, and we started fasting then. Fine, maybe that's what the Pshat in the Rambam. But if you're going to suggest, like the Ravid is saying, that from the words Divrei Hatzomos v'Za'akasam Kiyam, that the Jewish people accepted upon themselves a formal observance of a fast day together with Purim, Ladoros, for all future generations, then how could the rabbis of BAYT Sheni institute a Nicanor day to supersede the fasting of that day? That's the Ravid's question. He says, so he says, "B'chlal yom tu umay parchinan b'gemara el b'nei arbeisar v'karu b'tzleis yom nikanarhu, kolomar v'amay mutorn bo behesped of a taanis." And the Gemara itself doesn't make any sense, because the Gemara says, why should you be allowed to fast on the 13th of Adar if it's Nicanor Day? But how could they institute Nicanor Day in the first place? Yesh lomar dile'inyan mutarn behesped makshahu b'taanis vadayinu asher da'adar rabba meikar hatakanahi. The answer is you have to modify your understanding of the Gemara. When the Gemara says that Nicanor Day is a day that you're not allowed to eulogize, it doesn't preclude the permissibility to fast. In other words, it's a splitting hairs kind of thing. Normally we understand when the Mishnah says you're not allowed to eulogize on that day, it also means you're not allowed to fast. But no. When it comes to Nicanor Day, the rabbis had a conflict. They wanted to commemorate the fasting of Esther, but at the same time, they saw that it was a day that Hashem did a great miracle for them that they wanted to commemorate. So basically they said, go ahead and fast to commemorate the fasting of Esther. That's perfectly fine. That's the long-standing minhag from the times of the Jews in Persia. But at the same time, when you have a levaya on the 13th of Adar, you can't have hespedah. So you can't. So you're allowed to fast, and you're supposed to fast, but you can't have hespedah. Okay. We're not going to have time to run through the pre-Chadash. You can take a look at that in your own time. But just as a Meir Makom, it's pre-Chadash and Siman Tov Reish Pei Vav, Sivkat and Beis. And I just want to finish off with an interesting tshuva that I just happened to find from Rav Menashe Klein once again in his Mishnah Halachos. entitled Tam Shemisan and Taanis Esther, Why We Fast on Taanis Esther. And he's quoting from a colleague of his who had suggested to him that because of the nebulous nature of where Taanis Esther comes from, we have to figure out another reason why the Jewish people accepted upon themselves the minhag to fast. What we've seen tonight is that there's a number of possibilities. It's not because of the fast that Esther said, Vitsumu alai shaloshes yomim. That's clearly that it's not. It's either, it seems to be, however, that there was a historical fact that everyone seems to point to, that the Jewish people did fast in preparation for war. The tzarachian of that is that there is never any indication, at least not explicitly, that the rabbis instituted this Taanis at all. The Gemara is totally oblivious to this fast, and it totally ignores it in the Sugya and Maseches Taanis. And therefore, either it was sort of implicit, like the Rabbi suggested, even though they say the 13th of Adar is Nicanor Day, and of course you can't have Hespedim, but they weren't precluding the opportunity to fast on that day, and it was sort of like not a relevant issue, which is a little bit shtickle tzarachian. Or it was instituted sometime after Churban Bayis Sheni as a commemoration. But even then, the question then becomes, well, then why did it all just of a sudden crop up? If it wasn't instituted before, if it wasn't something that the rabbis instituted for all posterity, why all of a sudden did it get started? So there's a Rav who was writing to Rav Menashe, Zichrono Livracha, and he asks him, he suggests the following thing. It's in source number 15, it's in Mishnah Halachos Chelik Ches in Reish Lamed Gimel, and he says, Uvedavar ha-Taanis Esther shehislavtu harishonim zal l'Taanis mazu osa, like what's the origin of this fast? And he says that my dear colleague Yotza Lechadesh wants to try and provide us with a novel reason. Kevin she'ikar mitzvahs Purim hula besume adelo yada. He says, since the whole mitzvah of Purim is to intoxicate oneself to the point of adelo yada, he says, b'zeh davar misukan da'asi la'amshuchei basrei, and the reason why it's dangerous is because it could lead to alcoholism, is really what he's saying. In other words, you're going to become a habitual drunk. La'amshuchei basrei means, like, in other words, once you've tasted what it feels to be drunk and to be high, then you're going to want to be high all the time. Right? So, as a result, ulahaktim shichrus kodem hapurim, and what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to get started on the festivities a little early. You're going to say, I got my, someone just told me there's a name for it here. Was it 24? What is it called?
May 2-4.
May 2-4? It's the big kegs? A 2-4?
24.
The beers.
Yeah. 24.
Okay. A 24-pack?
Yeah.
A twofer? A twofer. Okay. All right. God bless. Anyway, so a person's going to be tempted to ulahaktim shichrus koydem hapurim, and you're going to want to try and sort of get the festivities started a little bit early, So the gam la'achar hapurim, and you're going to want to continue after Purim. It says v'lochein la'achar hapurim v'lo ya'avor ksiv. He says to prevent us from going beyond Purim, the Megillah writes v'lo ya'avor. That's explicit in the Gemara that there's no celebration of Purim beyond the 15th of Adar. Umiu tiknu tzom lifnei Purim, but they instituted a fast before Purim shelo yakdimu hashichrus v'lo yavo l'dei takala. But they instituted a fast day before Purim to sort of put the brakes on celebration starting too early.
Rabbi, it's like tailgating in football.
What's
Tailgating in football.
Pre-game.
a pre-game celebration? Yes. Okay.
People are drinking in the stomach.
It's reason Magdimim. There you go. Right. So they wanted to prevent us from doing a tailgate party, and so therefore they said you have to fast before. Rav Menashe says it's not so pasha to me. He says, look, the very fact that they told us that the mitzvah of Seudah doesn't start until the daytime. There's no mitzvah Seudah at the night of Purim. That in itself should be our indication that there's no mandate to get started early. So he says, I'm not so sure. But he says, it could be, maybe yes, maybe no. He says, and then he quotes the Rabbeinu Tam, and he says that, they went to Milchama, but he says he adds an extra twist to it, and this is what this will conclude. he says the extra twist is that the Jewish people fasted when they went to war, and the Ta'anit aspect of Ta'anit Esther is not sadness. It's preparation to go out to war in anticipation of victory. Right? So that's why Taanis Esther is not accompanied by the normal sadness that is accompanied by a regular Taanis. And that also helps to mitigate Taanis Esther when there's a compelling reason not to fast.